2 months after President Trump abruptly fired FBI Director James Comey in 2017, he nominated Christopher Wray to lead the country's top law enforcement agency for a 10-year term. But now, with 3 years still left in that term, Wray is reportedly preparing for the very real possibility that he will be fired before it ends. And he is not alone. If Trump makes good on his promises, the entire Justice Department may soon be hollowed out and replaced by a cast of Trump loyalists. Many career Justice Department attorneys reportedly do not plan on sticking around long enough to find out whether Trump's threats are real or just campaign bluster. Joining me now is the author of that piece, senior legal affairs reporter at Politico, the great Josh Gerstein. Josh, thanks for joining me tonight. I'm very curious to hear your assessment about how much of this is attrition and whether and how much of this is just, Trump coming in and, inciting mass layoffs here. What is the mood inside the DOJ in terms of the career lawyers who still work there?
Well, Alex, it's pretty grim and pretty glum at the moment, I would say. How many of those people are going to decide to actually leave their jobs voluntarily before January 20th, I think is still an open question. People I talk to seem to be inclined to try to stick it out until they find it untenable to do that anymore. But at the moment, they're very nervous. And one key reason is that a lot of these people have been through this already. They've been through this from 2017 to 2021. They saw what a chaotic scene it was at the Justice Department. I've been covering the Justice Department for a long time, and we remember being called in because, hey, it looks like Jeff Sessions is going to get fired today, or Rod Rosenstein is going to get fired, or Bill Barr is going to resign. And you had that kind of tumult going on over a 4-year period. And everybody I've talked to now expects it to only be more chaotic, unpredictable, and perhaps off the rails than the previous administration.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about the Jeff Sessions and Rod Rosensteins of the world. Trump likes to fire people. He likes to fire acting heads or heads. But Vivek Ramaswamy, who we have reporting tonight, is going to have a role in the new Trump administration. In 2023, proposed mass layoffs, firing, I think, as much as firing 75% of the federal workforce. And he believed that the Supreme Court would back him up. I mean, is there any expectation that this may not be a sort of case-by-case basis? Am I staying? Am I going? Just a massive bloodletting? Is that even being discussed inside the DOJ?
Well, I think the main concern is sort of more of an ethical and moral concern that people don't want to be put in a position of having to defend something like family separation or something worse than family separation. But there is another concern, which, as you say, is sort of a mass bloodletting, a mass layoff. There's this thing called Schedule F, where Trump, or at least in Project 2025, you see it there, and at the end of his previous term, talked about massive cutbacks in the civil service and basically eliminating civil service protections, so you would not only have fewer people in these federal government agencies, but the political appointees could choose at will which career people they would keep and which ones they would get rid of, which is basically the end of the civil service, which is supposed to be merit-based and have some criteria other than politics. So there is definitely widespread concern about that within the Justice Department, both among lawyers and other career staff that have been there for a long time and might have a harder time finding a job than a talented lawyer who's already at the department.
Well, and then there are the people that Trump has suggested he's going to run out of the country, like Special Counsel Jack Smith. I mean, can you talk a little bit about that predicament, how, these very prominent heads of certain, whether it's investigations or even Merrick Garland, the AG, what the sort of consensus or what the feeling is about how worried they need to be about the future?
Well, there's always some change in how the Justice Department is handled from Republican to Democratic administrations going back and forth, maybe more emphasis on civil rights or more emphasis on environmental enforcement. But what we have potentially coming in here is very not normal, which is all these people around Trump saying there are going to be special prosecutors investigating the special prosecutors. And not only that people that the names you mentioned, people like Jack Smith might be on the line, but anybody who might have worked with Jack Smith at any time in any capacity could find themselves potentially prosecuted, investigated. It could be very expensive for them and throw them out of government. That's a very abnormal and unusual situation, and that's part of what's inspiring the fear inside the walls of DOJ at the moment.
Yeah, nothing about this is normal. Josh Gerstein doing some really important reporting from inside the DOJ. Thanks as always, Josh, for your time tonight.
Take care.